All right, sorry for the delay. I will be trying to articulate myself. Is this loud enough for the people in the back? Okay, and otherwise, hopefully, is it good on Zoom? I'll let someone else monitor Zoom and tell me if they have any questions, whatever. But yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Professor Sarah Abraham. I was asked to talk a little about sort of my interest in cooperative games. And so I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm not actively working on this project right now. It's something I'm hoping to be getting back to soon, but it's been on hiatus for the past few years. But the idea of designing for prosocial behaviors is very interesting to me. Now, I haven't defined what prosocial behaviors are. I will get to that in time. I think the big question is, why are some players good at playing nicely and some players are not good at playing nicely? And that's a very interesting question. So let's actually start by breaking down multiplayer experiences. And there are basically three types of multiplayer experiences you can create. They're not mutually exclusive, by the way. You can create competitive multiplayer experiences, cooperative multiplayer experiences, and what's called co-play cooperative multiplayer experiences. So when we talk about competitive games, we're talking about games that have winning and losing conditions. And usually in competitive games, in order for one person or team to win, another person or team must lose. This is what's called a zero-sum game in game theory. And we'll actually be talking about game theory in a bit. Fighting games are a really classic example of zero-sum competitive games. You don't get to, at the end, you won or you lost, right? You either got a V on your side or you didn't. So it's very clear who won or lost. These can also be team-based games, but even in a game like Team Fortress, you still have a winning team and a losing team at the end of the round. Now, I put this here because you might be like, well, isn't that a cooperative game? Yes, cooperative games have an objective or goal that may or may not be winning. So for example, Portal 2, the co-op campaign, the goal is to win. What is win defined as? It's defined as getting through the next door. So you're basically opening a door. That's the winning condition. This objective to win can involve two or more players in coordinated actions. So again, your Team Fortresses, your Valorants, your Overwatches, they are inherently competitive because there's winning and losing teams, but they are cooperative because they're built around the idea of team-based gameplay. Finally, co-play is games that have an objective or goal that may or may not be some winning condition. I'll come back to Journey quite a bit. This is a game where the goal is to make progress through the level. But you can have even more abstract goals in, for example, Harvest Moon. I'm sorry, that's not Harvest Moon. That's Animal Crossing. Harvest Moon actually does have similar, like there's kind of defined win conditions or not. But in Animal Crossing, when you play with friends and show off your island, I mean, why, right? There's no goal. It's not like you won. You can make a competition around it, but at the end of the day, you do it because you are co-playing. You want to enjoy the world with your friends. So players can interact with other players, but it is not required for you to interact to complete objectives or win. Now, if you think about it, we have a lot of different games that are potentially all three of these. So in MMOs, you have often PvP, so that's competitive. You have PvE, which is cooperative. And you also have co-play where you just hang out with your friends with no real objective. Same thing with Minecraft, right? You can choose what the objectives are. In fact, even with games like Dark Souls co-op, it's both competitive because you're fighting invaders, but you can also cooperate on teams to either defeat the enemy group or defend a territory. So all of these things can coexist inside a game space. Now, in general, I think we all agree that playing with other people is pretty fun. Most people like playing games with their friends. And so in like this ideal reality, we play games, it brings us together regardless of race or religion or orientation or any of these things. We all come together under one banner and we all are heroes united. But in reality, it doesn't really turn out that way, does it? Now, I'm not going to talk about modern Blizzard scandals because we can talk about that, but it won't be relevant per se. But I mean, Blizzard has other issues going on even before all of this darkness was being revealed. Blizzard had a problem with Overwatch basically on launch, largely. Launch of competitive mode primarily. So that's a big deal. And the question then is, what is the relationship between cooperation and toxicity? And so let's just kind of explore this. By the way, if anyone has any questions or comments, I will take them. I'll be doing this in a slightly more presentation style, so I'll just kind of answer questions, but if anyone wants to interrupt, please feel free to do so. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cooperation and toxicity. Just actually a quick poll. Does everyone feel like they know what toxicity is? Yeah, okay. Well, I'll still give you some definitions and we can kind of agree or not. Let's actually talk about that thing I mentioned earlier, prosocial behavior. This is a psychology term, and it basically means an action that is constructive, positive, and beneficial to society as a whole. So prosocial behavior can benefit an individual or a group. So if you do something that in any way benefits somebody else or a group of people, or as a group, you do something that benefits other people, you're engaging in prosocial behavior. Empathy, I'm going to use the definition, the ability and tendency to share and understand others' internal states. This is a very broad definition, and we're going to see that we actually can subdefine it in various ways. Finally, for toxicity, I'm just going to grab straight out of the dictionary. The state, I've misspelled that, of being toxic, an extremely harsh, malicious, or harmful quality. This is not about internet toxicity, it's about general toxicity, but I think it applies pretty well to internet toxicity. So how do these things relate? Why are cooperative games, things like League of Legends, Overwatch, Dota, among many others, why are games that are built around people cooperating? The entire point is to have a team dynamic. Why are those actually the most toxic games on the internet? And I haven't proven to you that League is the most toxic game on the internet, but actually if you look at Reddit forums and evaluate them under basically psychological indicators of toxicity, that's a thing you can do based on language processing. League is up there with like hate groups in terms of toxicity, right? So it's like it's not a pretty sight. And I actually think many of you who plays League, you're not going to argue with me, right? You're not going to be like, oh, League is actually really nice. People are really nice on it. So we know that there's a toxicity problem. Now, what is toxicity? Well, to be honest, it's actually harder to define, to make it more specific. There's a famous Supreme Court judge ruling about pornography. I'll know it when I see it. And whether or not we agree that that's a good way to define pornography, I think we're going to have to use that definition when defining toxicity. We sort of know when people are being toxic. Now, toxic players can fall under categories such as trolls, griefers, know-it-alls, bigots, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes we think people who don't know what they're doing are toxic because they're ruining our day. That's probably not actually fair, but by some definition, the actions that they do maybe does seem toxic. Frankly, if you've played an online game, you've probably related to having experienced one of these. And I won't ask for hands, but you might have even been participating in toxicity is actually fairly likely depending on how you engage with your community. But how does this relate to empathy? Right? Generally we'd say if people are being toxic, they're not being very empathetic. But that's actually not really true. You can actually be quite empathetic and very toxic. Because under that definition of empathy, we can define empathy in a few ways. And again, these are several psychological definitions of empathy that are commonly used. Cognitive empathy is understanding how another person feels or what they may be thinking. So that's sort of the intellectual understanding of empathy. Emotional empathy is actually sort of physically experiencing what you perceive another person is experiencing. So if you've ever experienced sympathetic embarrassment, you've experienced emotional empathy. You are experiencing the same physiological reaction that you would experience if you were in that person's shoes right now. Yeah, just a second. Finally, what most people think of empathy when we say empathy is what's called compassionate empathy. So this is the understanding or experiencing what another person is feeling and being moved to help as needed. So not only are you moving to action, but you actually are motivated in some way to help. So it turns out that cognitive empathy is an essential skill in competitive games. In fact, you could actually argue that to be good at a competitive game, you have to have very high cognitive empathy. Who plays like fighting games? I know we got a few league players, we got MOBA players, other games like that. At some point, your skill level maxes out with your ability to execute an action, and the next level of skill will be predicting player behavior. Therefore, you have to understand what players want, and then you have to take that away from them. So in a sense, cognitive empathy is a huge part of competitive games. It's also really important for trolling. If you are bad at trolling, you won't understand what people want, and you won't be able to not give it to them. In fact, the whole point of a troll is to basically know what you want and take it away from you and to ruin your experience. And this actually goes back to some bullying research. I don't want to get too much into it, but there's a common misconception that bullies have low empathy. And again, that's not actually correct. Bullies tend to have very good social understanding and reasoning to basically navigate complex situations in order to get people on their side, in order to take away from what people want. So cognitive empathy is not a good place to stop at. Emotional empathy is actually not great either. So emotional empathy can overwhelm people and potentially cause people to lash out at the victims in many cases. This was demonstrated with some research into VR, using VR they were actually trying to build empathy by putting people into different situations. So like showing people what it's like to live as a schizophrenic. And so the VR experience basically recreates what schizophrenia feels like to a person who's suffering from that condition. And counterintuitively, or perhaps intuitively, people who played this game actually came out with less sympathy for people who were schizophrenic than before, because the experience of living through schizophrenia was actually emotionally traumatizing. And so then instead of being like, wow, that's horrible, we should help those people, they're like, I hate everything about this, and I don't want anything to do with these people. So in many cases, we have to be careful about inundating with people with too much of an experience if they're not emotionally prepared to handle it, because it will not necessarily lead to a positive outcome. So when we talk about getting to prosocial behaviors, what we sort of ultimately want is to facilitate compassionate empathy. The ability to get people to a state where they want to help people, and then they also feel for where that person is internally. Now, I'm not going to actually tell you how to do that, because it turns out that's actually really hard. It's very hard to make people compassionate. That's kind of a whole lifelong journey to get there. So instead, we're going to talk about how to build games that help facilitate this process and don't immediately lead to shutting it down. And to do that, let's actually quickly just sort of talk about PvP, player versus PvE, player versus enemy. PvP is inherently about competition. That's just what PvP games are. That's why it's called versus, right? Someone has to win. Now, the important part is competition is not inherently toxic. If so, we should just go and arrest everybody who goes to the Olympics every year, right? They're all competing. They must be jerks. The toxicity that we see in games tends to manifest toward the opponent, right? So this is, I feel weird using this term right now, but like when you teabag an enemy, right? That's being toxic. You're being a jerk. I'm not going to explain what that is if you don't know what that means. But you can also be toxic to your teammates. when you yell at your teammates, or you feed, or you do all these actions, you're basically taking out something, your aggression or your anger in some way on your teammates, and that would be considered as toxic behavior. And actually, if you want to look at who's successful in PvP circles, they're highly cooperative. If you yell at your teammates when you're trying to go to like world finals and like Counter-Strike or something, your team's not going to make it. Your team is going to crumble and no one's going to like each other and everyone's going to leave. It's true in team sports as well, right? You can't yell at people to get things done. So in a sense, all the behaviors we're seeing of toxic players are preventing them from moving into higher levels of skill and ability. That won't stop people from doing it though, right? At the same time, player versus enemy games are inherently about teamwork. The whole game is built around you working with the team to accomplish a goal together. But cooperation in these games is not actually necessarily pro-social. Each player has their own wants and needs that may differ from what is best for the group or other players. I'm going to use a Final Fantasy 14 example because I do actually play that. And a common thing that would happen is if you're trying to pug, like for example, Savage, which is fairly difficult content that you need other players to do what they're supposed to do. And you just want to get your clear for the week and another player wants to parse. And they're going to kill the group every time until they get their purple or better parse. That doesn't actually suit my needs because I literally have like an hour a week that I can dedicate. So I just want to get my clear and move on with my life. We are both playing a cooperative game, but our goals are not in alignment. We want entirely different things out of the game. It can lead to a bad experience depending on how we interact with that interaction. So sort of the inherent question then is, how do individual players' wants and needs interact in multiplayer games? What is happening with these interactions? And I am a computer science professor, not a design professor. So I would be remiss if I didn't show you some math. I will not show you mathematical formulas, but I will talk a bit about this area of mathematics called game theory, because I actually think it's quite interesting and it gives you some insights into how we think about these things and try to formulate them in a system that we can make proofs and reason about. So game theory is a mathematical area that basically studies the interactions of rational agents. This term rational will be important later. It was created to understand economics, but it also applies to political, sociological, biological, philosophical problems. Basically, anytime you have multiple agents or people or things interacting in a system, we want some way to model those behaviors. It became extremely popular during the Cold War to understand the geopolitical situation between the superpowers, US and USSR. Again, obviously, this is actually highly relevant now, but again, I'm not going to have time to talk about current issues. But do keep in mind that, this is not, it doesn't just go away. So basically, if you've ever watched the movie War Games, you get the general gist. Who's watched War Games? If you haven't watched War Games, I'd actually highly recommend checking it out. It's a great movie. An AI computer plays all sorts of games ranging from bridge and checkers to thermonuclear tactical warfare. And it turns out that I'm trying to understand how to win in these different games. And of course, the famous conclusion is the only way to win is not to play, which I won't say more about that. But that's basically what we're thinking about. How do you win at these games and optimize payouts? Now, game types, this is a whole area of mathematics. I certainly can't cover all of it. We can talk about all sorts of emergent strategies based on game properties, cooperative versus non-cooperative strategies, symmetric versus asymmetric payouts, zero-sum versus non-zero-sum victory, simultaneous versus sequential action. All of these define how we play the games, but we don't need to go into that detail. Let's just talk about probably the most famous game theory game, Prisoner's Dilemma. And here we can see, does anyone play the nonary games? Yeah, so of course nonary games at some point talk about Prisoner's Dilemma, because nonary games are all about these psychological understandings and logical deductions of things. So in Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a non-zero sum, i.e. you can both, if one person wins, the other does not inherently lose, you can get different payouts. It's symmetric. We're gonna have the same actions available to us. It is simultaneous. We're gonna play our move at the same time the other person is playing their move. And there are two people. And this was created in the 50s. What makes it really famous is the following. And I'm actually not going to read this for you to spare my voice. I'll give you like a couple, 30 seconds to read through the basic premise. All right, has everyone had a chance to read through it? Okay, so also don't imagine that there's things like retribution after you get out. We don't know who our partner works for. There's no mob that's gonna come down on us for squealing. So don't worry about any of that stuff. The player choices are therefore, you either defect or you cooperate. This creates 4 different options that can happen. If A and B both defect, i.e. betray each other, they serve 2 years prison sentence. Oops. If A betrays B, but B remains silent, A will be set free, B will serve 3-year prison sentence. The symmetric thing will happen to B if A remains silent. So if A betrays B or B betrays A, the same payouts will happen, but to the other person. Finally, if they both cooperate with each other, they both remain silent, both of them will serve only 1 year in prison on the lesser charge. So we can build a payout matrix from this that looks something like this. And what this basically says is this is the payout for A for cooperating. If they cooperate and B cooperates, they get one reward. If they cooperate and B defects, they get the right side of the matrix. And similarly, if they defect, one of these 2 options will happen depending on what the other player picks. And then we can see that B has the same choices available to them. And what's the solution to the problem? What should you do under any situation, payout wise? Yeah, they should always defect. That's obviously the obvious, the best payout. So if you cooperate, the best that's ever going to happen is you serve 1 year sentence versus 3 years. But if you betrayed, you would be free in that 1 year case, and you'd only get 2 years if you both betray. So there's actually never any incentive to cooperate. This is why it's called a dilemma, because both prisoners know that they should always defect. And so both prisoners will end up in the 4th quadrant every single time. There's actually no way to escape this. If you knew someone was cooperating, you'd still betray them because then you go free. There's never really any incentive for either player to change their strategy. This is what's called a Nash equilibrium. If we look at this, we could say, well, that's not actually great, because if we both cooperated, we'd actually be at what's called Pareto optimal. We would have the ability to serve 1 year instead of 2, and that seems strictly better than the alternative. Well, to redefine these things, just to make sure it's clear, Nash equilibrium, named after the economist Nash, is basically the idea that a player has no incentive to deviate from their current strategy given the other player's strategy. So it doesn't really matter what they're going to do. You're always just going to play your strategy. It's basically how I understand how you play Magic the Gathering. I might be wrong, but my understanding of Magic is you just play your cards and you don't really care what happens and you kind of hope you win. I might be playing it wrong. I realize that, but that's how I understand it. Pareto optimal says no player can get a better payout without making another player have a worse payout. So again, Pareto optimal says, sure, we both get 1 year, but no one's getting 3 years. And Pareto optimal in this case is strictly better than Nash equilibrium because I'd rather have 1 year than 2 years. But both of these are inaccessible to us without everyone modifying our strategy to reach it. So we cannot pick always defect as our strategy, nor can we say if they cooperate, I will choose to defect. Side note, if we iterate this problem, it changes a bit. So if you just play Prisoner's Dilemma once, you have great incentive to always betray. If you're constantly playing this game with new people, it turns out that's not actually the optimal strategy. I'm not going to prove it here. It's a geometric and infinite sequence, but we can see that you can do it mathematically. The point is that if you make an assumption that you are playing either an infinite number of games or you don't know how many times you're playing, and that future payoffs are discounted, i.e. you care more about payoffs now than later, you will see that under the assumptions, cooperative strategies become the new Nash equilibrium, i.e. always run this strategy, there is no better strategy. 2 examples of better strategies are Grim Trigger and Tit for Tat. Grim Trigger says players cooperate until opposing player in game defects, then they will always defect. Tit for Tat says player cooperates first round, then mimics opposing player's choice in previous round for all subsequent games. So if someone betrays, you defect on the game after. If someone cooperates on that game, you cooperate the next round. They were both successful, more successful than always defect. Tit for Tat with forgiveness being the winning deterministic strategy. With forgiveness basically means there's some small percentage chance that you'll choose to cooperate even if the previous person defected. So what's kind of interesting is that the conditions for success are sort of these qualities. You have to be nice and assume the best of the opponent player in some sense. You have to retaliate when bad actions are taken. You have to forgive as much as possible bad actions. And you have to be not envious, i.e. you can't wish to have someone else's score. So you can't undermine both of yourselves in order to lower someone else's score. And this is all really well and good. And this actually does give us some ideas of how we can start to think about this. But there's a couple really, really important limitations. Namely, we assumed rational agents, i.e. agents just want to get the optimal payout, whatever that payout is. Concepts like altruism, revenge, societal expectations, these are not actually rational and cannot be modeled under the same way. So if I want to do something like people are just nice and have altruism, I can't really model that, nor can I model something like I am going to get you in a revenge way, even though that's a very common, powerful human nature thing that comes into play in a lot of these things. So behavioral theory is trying to get at that, but behavioral theory will then basically take traditional game theory predictions and add in psychological effects. So it's understanding game theory in a psychological way. It's going to look for things like altruism, fairness, framing effects, social cooperation, group decision-making, et cetera, and try to reason about it in a statistical way rather than just a provability way. So probably the most famous game from this branch is what's called ultimatum game. And there's many derivatives. This is the original form of ultimatum. In the ultimatum game, a proposer is given a sum of money to split with the responder. The proposer can propose a fair split, i.e. 50-50 or 40-60, something like that, 60-40 in that case, or an unfair split, which might be something like 80-20, or something that's very, very unequal. The responder can then accept or reject this offer. If the responder accepts the offer, the money is distributed according to the proposed split. If the responder rejects, neither player receives anything. So now the idea is we now have the ability to punish bad offers by saying neither of us get anything. Now, this game is actually really easily solved for a Nash equilibrium sub-perfect game, basically subgame perfect. Basically means will apply to every single game. Nash equilibrium in this case is that proposer always makes an unfair offer and responder always accepts offer. right? Because if I give you $100, if I give you $1 of $100, you are actually $1 richer than you were before. It wasn't your money to begin with. So there's no such thing as an unfair offer. You basically make profit accepting any offer. Therefore, the proposer has no reason to make a fair split. They can propose an unfair split and you should still accept. Now, do people accept? This is actually a really complicated question. So as you might expect, in the initial running, which was in the United States, which is important because there's going to be some cultural context here. And I don't remember who they ran it on, probably college students. So that's also turns out to be a fairly small subset of the population, not uniformly distributed. It turns out people do punish defecting behavior, right? So it turns out people would rather say, I don't want an unfair split than have any split at all. So the ability to punish unfair splits was actually quite high. When they switched it to different cultures, it didn't actually hold true. So it turns out in other cultures, and other socioeconomic areas, it turns out that a dollar is a dollar and you'd rather have the money than not have the money. There's also a lot of cultural context about fair versus unfair. So again, in some cultures, they're like, well, it wasn't our money to begin with, so I don't see why this is unfair. I still got something out of it. There's also social expectations of gift-giving reputation. So specifically, they did an experiment in some of the Mongolian Turkic tribes in Central Asia, and it turns out the proposer was very hesitant to make a bad offer because that basically lost them face. And similarly, a person would accept bad offers because they wanted to be basically generous. They didn't want to lose face. So it turns out reputation was actually more important than questions of even the monetary concern. Okay, well, that basically says we learned nothing, right? Anything can happen. Society is very complex. Human behavior is very complex. We didn't really learn anything. I would actually argue these concepts do apply to video game design, specifically in one really key way, which is understanding reward mechanisms. So when you are designing games, you are inherently building out reward mechanisms constantly. In fact, games are like the most Skinner box types of things we can possibly create. You do a thing I like, I give you a thing you want. You want experience points? Great, do this thing and get experience points. You want a gold star? I'll give you a gold star. So games are all about training players to want the rewards that the game wants to give and rewarding them when they do and punishing them when they do not do what they do. Just as an example, so I know Dark Souls is a very popular type of franchise and style of game. You can actually say that a lot of the incentivization is, of course, dying. It's sort of the punishment. It's not actually that punishing, though, right? It feels punishing because you lose experience and you lose this sense of accomplishment. But it's not like a rogue game where you literally start over at the beginning. But what these games are actually punishing is you being aggressive and you kind of jumping in without exploring what's actually happening in the scenario. So you are being trained by this game to be cautious, to look for boss tells, to explore the world in a generally cautious way. And then once you have enough stats or you have enough experience, then you can go really fast and impress people, right? So the game still is training you, even though it's not giving you a gold star, right? You still have experience, you still have some stuff that you might want. Now, players can engage with these systems in ways that the designer does not intend. Who has experienced this as a designer? Has anyone played your game in a way that you didn't really expect people to play it? Yeah, in fact, you don't really know how people are going to play your game. MMOs are a great example of this because most people don't play any of the main thing that people are designing in MMOs. They just want to hang out and look nice and talk to their friends, right? It's basically a glorified chat system for a lot of people, but that's still a valid way to play. I actually have a great example. I don't know if I should use it. I was talking to a friend at Crowfall, and apparently housing is the thing in Crowfall. So people don't even really want a PvP. They just want to take over a world and then build houses. And it's like, well, that's really the point of the game is to PvP, but like here we are. So you don't really know how people will engage with your system. So you can't really just incentivize pro-social behavior. You can't really say you get a cookie if you do something nice, because the people who are going to be nice are probably going to do that anyway. And the people who don't want to be nice are not going to want the cookie. So the real question is, how do you disincentivize antisocial and or toxic behavior? And I would argue that when we do disincentivization, we usually do it punitively, like banning people who are not nice. That actually does work to some degree. That's actually League's main tool for dealing with toxicity. But broadly speaking, punishment really doesn't work as well as reward. We just know that. That's true for animals. It's true for humans. Punishment takes longer to train than if you just give rewards. So the question is, how do you design gameplay to remove fun that comes from antisocial behavior, i.e. defecting? So we may or may not punish defectors, but we really don't want to give them any reward for defecting. Then, of course, the big one is if you can build a community around cooperative nice features rather than toxicity competition. Again, competition doesn't have to be toxic, but it often is for sort of side reasons. That's kind of the best thing, is that people get indoctrinated when they come into a new game and they're trained to be polite. League is actually kind of famous for this because, again, going back to that research on League Reddit, if you follow people who engage in the League of Legends forums and then go into other subreddits, what's really interesting is their language in League tends to be incredibly toxic. But then as soon as they're talking in another context, they're actually back to more what we call sort of normal spectrum of word choice. So people actually behave more toxically in League than they would outside of League. And I would actually argue that's largely because the League community is sort of built around this idea of toxicity, for better or for worse. I don't think it was intentional, but it's sort of how we ended up here. So I'm not going to talk about this because this is like very complicated, but let's just talk about like understanding incentivization. So Little Big Planet is actually one of my favorite games. I just think it's a really great game. If you just sort of high level overview, there are really clever puzzle designs designed for single player and multiple players. So it rewards playing with up to 4 people. Local co-op, in my experience, is really positive. People play with each other in ways that conforms to the group's norms. If you all want to troll each other, we're all friends and we all control each other, and that's fine. If we don't like trolling, we can tell our friends, no, I don't want to be trolled. So this is fine. Local, as soon as we go online, my experience was actually that people were playing, they can't really do anything mean to you. They can't yell at you. They can't curse at you. They can slap you. That's about all they can do. But you can't set up situations to basically kill other players. Going quickly, because if you get left behind, you'll be killed. And I noticed that actually, in general, people who played, when I was playing, I didn't play that much online. It tends to happen because you actually get rewarded. You get to collect the most bubbles. So the reward is actually to play faster and be ahead of other people. And actually, every time they die, they lose bubbles. So great. If you want to win, in some sense, you can do that. On the other hand, Journey is a game that has no real incentivization structures for defectation. Many people probably haven't played Journey. It's a very light puzzle solving game, but it's primarily an aesthetic heavy experience. There is an online matchmaker that allows people to pair up or leave in a very smooth way. If you don't want to play with your partner, you can just leave them. If you get enough distance, you'll be match made to a new person, and they will as well. There's these limited emotes, so you can kind of chirp at a person, but it's really cute. So if someone's like circling around you and chirping at you, they might be trying to say really racist, sexist things at you, but you're like, oh, that's really cute, they like me. So there's no way to actually convey your hatred to another person. And that's actually a good thing. So you can't really troll people, you can just leave them behind. Let me just wrap up. I was gonna talk about my game for a bit. Okay, yeah, so just So my game that is currently on hiatus, my goals were to be narrative-centric cooperative game. I wanted to emphasize cooperative puzzle solving over cooperative combat. I think cooperative combat is actually very well explored. Brawling, I mean, quite literally, Elden Rings, the new Platinum game, all of them are just doing it, right? It's all cooperative combat. And then the other thing that I don't know, this is where I'm sort of like stuck on, allowing people of different skill levels to play together in a satisfying way. That actually turns out to be really, really hard. But that's like my interest because I think that really does build sense of community if you can play with somebody who's a different skill level. Games I like ICO. I really like ICO. I like Journey. I like Little Big Planet. I actually have mixed feelings about Never Alone. I really like the concept of Never Alone, but I felt like the execution was a little bit lackluster, especially for being a game to help bring a new pod culture outside of that group. But it's still actually a really big inspiration in terms of lessons learned, what works, what doesn't. And then finally, I really like Shadow of Colossus, the boss battles, the idea of like that, they're puzzles. They're actually not, you don't fight the boss, you puzzle it. And I think that's like super, super interesting. So the idea would be that I want to create a game with an asymmetric play experience. Puzzles in combat are built around an asymmetric toolkit. So each character has a unique mechanic for completing levels. In the case of Katya, she can run, jump, grow plants, swing, climb, destroy plants, rocks. There's sort of special mechanics for bosses and whatnot, but it's basically built around traversing with your vine whip and destroying and growing wet routes to new areas. The Wolf Volk has run, double jump, A-way dash, basically a charge dash, dig to go through places, bite and charge attack. And all that is to say, like, that's all fine, right? You can do it. It's all about execution more than how you build things in practice. The design philosophy is progress can only be made when both players complete the level. Similar to Portal 2, you either both make it or you don't make it. There's no incentive to troll because you're just stuck in the level with them. Death of one character resets the level for both characters. Again, that's actually Portal 2 co-op aesthetic as well. Actually, this is a hard constraint. Shared screen. I didn't want to do split screen. I don't like split screen. It's really hard on a smaller TV. So I wanted to do shared screen. The problem is now you have to build your whole level around being in a fairly small space. The other sort of broad goals, both players should have something to do while the other player is acting, even if it takes a while. Puzzles, traversal, and combat should allow for equal skill levels between partners. You can switch between characters so that if someone's having trouble, you can say, hey, I want to take over and do it. And then again, the eternal struggle of player package, how to make a player package intuitive, easy to pick up, and easy to swap between characters without losing much time. And then, of course, there are a bunch of team up actions. Why would you play a game with a girl and a wolf if you cannot ride the wolf, I would argue. So yes, that is the team up action. You can also call, that's straight out of ICO. Pull up is basically reaching areas that are inaccessible. And then, of course, you can do friendly emotes. No unfriendly emotes, just friendly ones. Various special actions. I don't really have time to talk about game narrative, but I like Team ICO games. So, of course, it's going to have like a brutal, sad theme because I just like brutal, sad games. I don't know what to tell you. As of now, the reality is couch co-op is much easier to think about than networking. I have built out the network framework. I'm not talking about, as y'all who took game programming paradigms know, networking is hard, like in practice, but it's also just hard to think about mechanically. So couch co-op avoids toxicity issues. If your partner is being toxic, you honestly shouldn't be friends with them. Just leave. That's a good personality test. It's also an underserved market. Online friend play that has network overhead. But again, if you play with a friend, hopefully they treat you respectfully. Matchmaking is where it gets more challenging. It's also where it gets more interesting. How do you allow people to swap in and out of games such that they can play the way they want to do without hurting or bothering another person? And just FYI, I'm not trying to pick on League constantly, but in a way they've dealt with this more. they kind of have a way to put you into a toxic pool. If you're a real jerk, you basically end up in sort of the cesspit of other jerks, and then you really can't matchmake your way out of it. And that's kind of nice, but it's also kind of bad societally. I'm not sure it's actually good for society to put people with other toxic people to kind of feed on each other broadly, but that's like a thing that I'm not going to address. That's like a bigger, again, a very complicated topic. But in general, I think it's nice to not sort of punish toxic people outside of removing them from people whose experience they're ruining. Story mode would have been, therefore, which is what I'm working on currently, would be online couch co-op. If I wanted to think about longer tail, there would be challenge mode levels, and that would be the kind of thing you could matchmake. For trials, you can add in competition, that kind of thing. But that's all, that's like way down the road. I've not really fleshed that out. Honestly, right now, it's more a matter of just building out all the levels, all the art primarily. So I have levels. The question is refinement. As y'all know, most of your time is actually spent refining things, not building things. The aesthetics are weak, right? Because I don't have an artist. So that building out aesthetics is also an important aspect of that. Finally, of course, you just play, test, and repeat until you're satisfied. And that's all I have for you. I apologize for running a bit late, but I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Overall punishment's not a very good way to incentivize a thing, right? You use punishment, and you use punishment to desensitize, disincentive that word, right? Things, and that's also not very fun in these cases, right? It's basically prison. Right?
Yeah, even if you. So, oh, go ahead, finish your question.
And so my question is, how do you plan to overcome that?
Oh, so the question for those on Zoom was, we have lots of ways to punish players. My voice came back. That's really nice. Oh, it's going away again. Oh well. Easy come, easy go. In like League, it takes a very punitive approach, and that's largely to preserve their community. So but that means that, like, as the term was, you're stuck in prison. And you know, realistically, prisoners' rights. Prisoners shouldn't be stuck in prison. They shouldn't have that impact the future of their career. I'm talking about broadly in the United States and other countries, but also in games, right? Like if you grew up, you're no longer 12, you're no longer impressed saying dirty words on the internet, you should be able to join the broader community. So the question is, punitive is easier. How do you fix that in a non-punitive way? I don't actually have an answer to that, because the reality is, it's actually just so complicated. I think the actual answer is community building. So like different online communities have different flavors to them. And so if you build a community that is less toxic, you sort of are in a situation where you will generally create a less toxic environment. I think that's actually the better long-term solution. Making gameplay mechanics is like one small part of that to kind of disincentivize it. But at the end of the day, people can be toxic if they want to be toxic. That said, the way you build community is going to be all about rewards. Like, what's your reward or punishment for being toxic? What's your reward or punishment for feeding the other team, right? So let's just use the classic League example or Boba example of you're mad at your team for not picking meta characters. So you're like, I'm going to feed. Well, what are you getting out of that emotionally? Probably you're getting a sense of power out of it. The ability to control another person's wins or losses. So you're affecting their rankings. If it's a match game, you're affecting their day. So I think like finding ways to sort of de-escalate in game would be one thing that would be really interesting. I will say that I actually like to talk to trolls just to sort of play with them. which maybe sounds mean, but I do it very nicely. So like, you can be like, "Yeah, you seem like you're having a really rough day. Is everything okay?" And basically, I just am interested in like, if you react to people in ways they don't expect and in ways that are exceedingly kind, maybe a little bit sarcastic on the back end, but try not to keep that too much in. Does that de-escalate or does that make that worse? And I think it varies person to person. But certainly, what a lot of these places are doing is if they start talking and saying mean things, you just sort of mute them and don't let them speak. So that's like that's the machine learning perspective on it. But I do think we need to think about it from a psychological perspective as well. And I don't have a good answer for that though. Yeah.
I don't know if Journey does it, but last audience, I know that the AI is kind of weird, but so what I'm trying to say is, so there's this one game, Metro Exodus, and it's got all these great mechanics, all this stuff, and on the side, one of the things we do is sometimes you do these NPCs, these AIs, who all they do is ask you to find the type of. And when you do give them the guitar, there is quite literally no reward that is related to helping you progress further into the game. There's nothing like, oh, here's a key, oh, here's money. Instead, what they get is that later on, you can find them playing their instrument. Would that be a fun social behavior? Like, there's really no reward to get out of it except the fact that you're playing.
Yeah, definitely. So the question is, can single player games have pro-social encouragement? And the example was Metro Exodus. Like many great Russian games, there's like, they just don't incentivize doing things. They're just like, yeah, if you give a person a guitar, they just see them playing it later. So your reward is just knowing that you helped this AI agent. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason that's here is because I love Team Ico games. But like you play with an AI in this game. So the emotional connection you make to an AI agent is actually just as real and valid as what you are experiencing with the human. And there's actually been research done in that as well. Role playing, which again can be role playing like with friends, but it also can be just role playing in a game, does actually teach you empathy because you're actually putting on a different set of shoes, you're understanding things from a different perspective, and you're experiencing cause and effect accordingly. So yeah, definitely single player games absolutely have it. I sort of in fact, if you actually look at my game inspirations, a lot of them are single player. But I'm sort of interested in like, well, what does that mean when I want to take that and play with a person? Like I love Shadow of Colossus, but it wouldn't have been kind of cool if a friend could have controlled the horse while I was playing the Wanderer or vice versa. So I think that, yeah, I actually came from that perspective of these single player games have great emotive empathy building experiences. What does it mean to kind of bring them into multiplayer?
Are there any kinds of like unique challenges or like different like differences between like cooperative and like co-play kinds of games? Like is it easier, like harder in one case to like incentivize for social distance?
I think co-play is hard to define as co-play is kind of hard to find if it's pro-social or not. I think a lot of co-play, I mean, most people who play on Minecraft servers usually play with friends. So usually they're going to play by the rules of their friends. In Animal Crossing and other sorts of games where you have some amount of interactions with other players, I think the ability to kind of show off your creation. So like, I think a lot of those games, the co-play is actually creating things and being like, look at this thing I made. I actually don't know how that works because if anyone remembers Second Life, within like 1 week of Second Life coming out, there was like swarms of penises running around, right? Like everyone made their avatar look like that. So, how do you control that? I think they just have heavy moderation. But yeah, I think understanding that you need to be careful about people trolling people in creative ways. And then also, of course, making sure children are safe is actually really important. If you know children are going to be playing your game. Yeah.
So second one, right, is it's just all about community. There's no real goal. You just kind of like hang out with people, all that talking about it. And obviously that, that big instance of someone really just walking around like that, not good. And from the game developer's perspective, that's not what you want in your code. Right? It's true, it's a social activity. That's a community on its own. That's not the community you want to promote. Right? But could we argue that some communities that are made on their own could be good? For example, there's a game a while back, but there's a big joke called Pools Closed. Right? I don't know. Yeah. And it was nothing like really toxic or anything. It was basically in this game, you can walk around in this world, this virtual world, and there are pools, right? And the whole joke is that people would dress up as the same character, they'd surround the pool, and they would say, "Pool's closed, no one can walk in. You can't go for people," right? Could argue that's toxic. So it's like its own community on its own. People could come to the game for that.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into community management questions, which I definitely don't feel like I've thought long and hard enough about. I think that's actually, like, I've never worked as a community manager, to be honest. So I can't really address it. I think what would happen in that meeting, though, would be the community manager would sit down with the team and they'd be like, okay, do we want people to be closing the pool, right? Like, is this good for our game community or is this bad for our game community? What does it say about our game community to foster that? Because yeah, that's sort of like light, I'll call it role playing in some sense, is actually really important for these types of games. But it also can be a big turn off for people who are trying to get into the game and are like, this person's being a jerk. They're like sitting on the mailbox and wow, right? Is that what, is it the mailbox?
You get really huge and you can't interact with it.
Yeah, that's like classic, right? Like you just block people from doing the things that they want to do in their daily activity. So I think it's like really important, like pranking has to be sort of figured out in the context of, is it an innocent prank that's not hurting people and people having fun, or are people unhappy, and what's sort of the rate of unhappiness to happiness? But yeah, I think you can do lots of that kind of stuff. Notably, lots of games don't let you block people for that exact reason. So you want to stand there, that's fine. I'm just going to go through you. Good question, though.
Probably end with that question in the interest of time, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.